look at that man. What are you so miserable about? Think of this as an act of pietas. Ireland is reduced as it has never been reduced before. We are talking about a colonized people on the brink of extinction. This is no time for a critical assessment of your ploys and your disgraces and your betrayals. That is the stuff of another history for another time. Now is the time for a hero. Now is the time for a heroic literature.
If you're asking me, will my story be as accurate as possible? Of course it will. But are truth and falsity the proper criteria? I don't know. Maybe when the time comes, my first responsibility will be to tell the best possible narrative. Isn't that what history is? A kind of storytelling.
Field Day Theatre Company is one of the most important cultural organisations in Ireland. It is one of the few to receive funding from both sides of the border. Field Day is based in Londonderry, or Derry, in Northern Ireland, close to the border with the Republic. Once a year, it brings together a group of actors for the opening night of a tour that begins in Derry and journeys to towns and villages right across Ireland.
An Irishman howling abroad. That's Christy Murrat's a song called Back Home in Derry. There's no need for us to sing that. We're here already. Fools that we are. Back home in Derry. Or should it be Derry stroke Londonderry, or indeed Stroke City? Who knows what to call this place these days? I blame history. And speaking of history, you could do worse than attend the premiere of Brian Friel's play, Making History. That's on in the Guildhall tonight. I'll be there with my calculator to count the centuries, just to make sure they get it right.
And now, with news of Brian Friel's new play, here's Sean Rafferty.
Field Day have created quite a reputation for themselves over the past 10 years, and of course a new play from the pen of Brian Friel is always something to be looked forward to. This is going on to the National Theatre in London. Making History is set in a turbulent period in Irish history, the end of the Gaelic chieftains, but it's much more than that. It's about making history and about perhaps the myths that we create for ourselves. Stephen Ray plays Hugh O'Neill. Neil Deane plays Archbishop Lombard, who's writing O'Neill's history his way.
There are echoes of today's politics right through this play. I mean, you keep being reminded of somebody by a sentence or by an attitude, and that's very intriguing. And in a way, it's it's almost like a historical and intellectual thriller.
Stephen, do you feel like O'Neill? Do you feel a sense of history in this part?
I feel like the man that Brian Friel has written for this play, whether that is the great O'Neill that people expect to see or anticipate, that's another matter. I think that's one of the interesting things about the play, is that it's his version of history, of what Hugh O'Neill was, and I think people will feel challenged by that. It'll break a mould that they have in their minds, perhaps.
Making History is the story of Hugh O'Neill, the 16th century Gaelic chieftain who fought a 9 years' war against Queen Elizabeth I. His reputation has been greatly exaggerated by Irish historians who rewrote his history for their own political purposes. Over the centuries, he's been used as a symbolic hero of Irish nationalism, despite the fact that he was educated in England and created an earl by Queen Elizabeth. In the history books, he is portrayed as a swashbuckling hero who learned more from his education than the English had intended. In 1942, Sean O'Whalen's book, The Great O'Neill, went some way to setting the record straight. In his introduction, O'Whalen says, If anyone wished to make a study of the manner in which historical myths are created, he might well take O'Neill as an example. Like all field day productions, Making History had its opening night in Derry's Guildhall.
The Guildhall building is a huge symbol of empire, of the union, of some kind of adherence to English principles. So, of course, there's an irony in us doing plays there, which maybe undermine that position, or certainly come from a different point of view. In Ireland, at this point, there's no question that there's a hunger for whatever it is we're peddling, whatever it is we show them, you know, and there's a kind of real need to explore something in this country. I think they're coming to find ways to make life in this island more possible.
In Making History, playwright Brian Friel sets up a confrontation between O'Neill and one of his first biographers, Archbishop Peter Lombard, who began the distortion of O'Neill's history.
And I hear you're writing our history, Peter.
Ah, Harry's been talking.
Have you begun?
No, just checking some events and dates.
And when your checking is done?
And I suppose I shall try to arrange the material into a shape. Eventually.
And interpret what you've gathered?
Not interpret, Hugh, just describe.
Without comment?
I'll just try to tell the story of what I saw and took part in as accurately as I can.
But you'll tell the truth?
The hero of the play is Hugh O'Neill, who was the last of the great Irish chieftains. He led the last of the resistance to English rule, to the imposition of English rule in Ireland, in Ulster. I mean, Ulster was the most rebellious of the four provinces. The others had really been tamed. But Hugh O'Neill, with an alliance of other chieftains, held out there to the 16th century, and in the end was defeated by Queen Elizabeth and had to flee with the other Irish chieftains, and took away the last of the sort of leadership of the Irish clans in what was called the Flight of the Earls. And it was the end of a concerted Irish resistance to British rule.
It's something, I think, the notion of the Flight of the Earls, as Friel debunks it, they ran away, is something that even for somebody in the Protestant tradition in Northern Ireland like myself, is very much part of my folk memory. And yet it's remote enough for me not really to know the details, not to know the facts. And I wouldn't say the play explodes them, but it certainly casts light on them. But I wouldn't want to see the play in for my own purposes in a very strict regional way. I think that it has a much more universal significance.
Well, it's a marvellous drama of the difficulties between England and Ireland, in the sense that it puts O'Neill into the context of a European figure, and it puts the whole Irish conflict with England into the context of the Spanish threat to England and why Ireland has remained different.
I think of Field Day as being, let's say, like the wooden horse of Troy. It's rolled inside the city gates and it opens out after hours, and instead of soldiers pouring out come actors.
I worked on the O'Neill play off and on for many years. So many years that I can't remember what first attracted me to him. I know O'Neill's social and political sophistication was attractive, and his capacity to inhabit, to dart into and out of his Gaelic consciousness and his English consciousness, his Gaelic experience and his English experience. He used them both, but he allowed neither to obsess him.
I'm no historian, Hugh. I'm not even sure that I know what the historian's function is, not to talk of his method.
But you'll tell the truth.
If you're asking me, will my story be as accurate as possible, then of course it will. But are truth and falsity the proper criteria? I don't know. Maybe when the time comes, my first responsibility will be to tell the best possible narrative. Isn't that what history is? A kind of storytelling.
Is it?
Imposing a pattern on events that were mostly casual and haphazard, and shaping them into a narrative that is logical and interesting. Oh, yes, I think so.
And where does the truth come into all this?
I'm not sure that truth is a primary ingredient. Is that a shocking thing to say? Maybe when the time comes, imagination will be as important as information. But one thing I can promise you, Hugh, nothing will be put down on paper for years and years. History has to be made before it's remade.
After a week-long season in Derry, the Field Day cast of 6 actors journey on across the country, playing one-night stands in schools and town halls, to audiences who don't normally get a chance to see theatre, as well as the established centres in Belfast and Dublin. Apart from Stephen Ray, all the actors in the company are coping with the experience of a Field Day tour for the first time. 59 performances in the space of 10 weeks in 21 different towns. Field Day was founded in 1980 by Stephen Ray and playwright Brian Friel. Their choice of productions has won them a political notoriety and a reputation for provoking debate, as well as setting high standards in Irish theatre. Belfast-born Stephen Ray has worked either as director or actor on all 8 productions by Field Day.
It's a bit embarrassing, the name, really. I don't know, everything has to be called something, doesn't it? Some people say it was Friel and Ray mixed together, but I don't know. I can't remember.
In the programme of their first production translations, Field Day published a definition of their name. A day on which troops are drawn up for exercise in field evolution. A military review. A day occupied with brilliant or exciting events. A day spent in the field, for example by the hunt or by field naturalists.
The military display, that's the dictionary definition. We thought that maybe we'd have a good time.
I'm not sure what history will say about Field Day. I imagine that history will accommodate Field Day into whatever narrative is appropriate for future people in certain circumstances, which is an idea that I looked at in making history. I don't think there's a single driving force behind Field Day any more than there's a single idea animating it or informing it. Maybe it's nothing more than the public expression of an affinity of interest between 7 people, each of whom jealously pursues his own artistic life, but who's happy to be expressed in this communal way. He may not fully agree with everything Field Day says and does. He certainly doesn't look to Field Day to represent him.
You mean bound and all by favour by December? I would hope, yeah. But we hope we do the both together.
In 1980, after we'd started, and there was Brian and I, and we had to pick a board. So we decided to pick a board of imaginative and interesting people rather than just a sleeping board. So we picked Seamus Heaney, the poet, Seamus Deane, the poet and critic, Tom Paulin, also a poet, David Hammond, filmmaker and singer, and more recently, Thomas Kilroy, playwright.
No matter what you would do, he was hell-bent on, you can talk about 10 minutes.
We're badly stuck, though, really, in terms of it again, aren't we?
And then what happened between turns?
You just got it was interspersed, his poetry was interspersed with your songs.
But I mean, did nobody make any kind of a
you introduced your
between?
own? No, it was said, you're going to hear poetry by so-and-so.
Oh, I see.
We never had an idea of Field Day as being a permanent thing. It'd be like a show band.
The life of a show band, it could last for 3 or 4 years, and then we would all go off and join some other band as well. But in fact, it hasn't. It has lasted 1979, 9 years already, and it might go on even longer.
Well, before I joined the board of Field Day, I made a statement about Field Day as being the most important movement in the country, or on the island, since the early days of the century. And what I was thinking of there was the whole kind of Irish literary renaissance with Yeats. And in a sense, what I was thinking of was the fact that that was unfinished business.
Field Day is an artistic action because it doesn't have a preset purpose. It doesn't have a manifesto to fulfill. It has a notion. It has an inspiration. It has a possibility of formal definition. Its purpose is to define itself. So it has an inner drama of possibility. But it also links into community action, if you like, you know. It mustn't just be simply community action, but it has this other artistic search for definition of each person in it. So I think that each person involved with it is appeasing some oath-bound feeling of needing to be of service, and at the same time, each person would be very, very, very afraid of offering themselves as servicemen to the community. The tour journeys on to play a one-night stand in Dungannon, once the homeland of Hugh O'Neill. This was the centre of his power, a place where traces of the man's legend can still be found, even among the streets of the Protestant community. A few miles outside Dungannon are the remains of an old fort. This is Tully Hogue, where the O'Neill crowning stone was kept and where Hugh O'Neill was crowned chieftain of his people.
Tully Hogue is just a remarkable place, isn't it? I mean, I went there not even knowing if anything existed of the old fort, and of course it's there in all its perfection, and it's a wonderful, pure atmosphere. And it's extraordinary to be somewhere that you know that O'Neill definitely was. There's a line in Making History: the land is the goddess that every ruler in turn is married to. We come and we go, but she remains the same. We've played Dungannon before, but there was something kind of extraordinary. I mean, I had a wonderful day that day, and there were a lot of children in the audience, and you know, it's very difficult to play for children, but they were quiet, incredibly well behaved. I think it's to do with acknowledging that where you are is the centre, you know, that it's important. You know, so Dungannon, for that night, was the centre of everything, you know. And I think it's great that kids know that, you know, that 10-year-old boys and girls were sitting knowing that their place was the centre of history, you know. I think it's great. One of the important things that I think we do is that people aren't getting ideas second-hand. They're getting them from the horse's mouth. They're getting them. We're delivering them to the people that should be hearing them. You know, they're not second-hand on television. It isn't an RSC tour. It's not being delivered from headquarters. It's being delivered from within.
In the play, Hugh O'Neill has just married an English wife, Mabel. She's not an aristocrat. She's a daughter of a Staffordshire colonist, really, a man who's been sent over to tame the Irish, to keep them under control. And his own people regard this as a most appalling act of betrayal and treachery. They can't understand why he's married outside his tribe, really. And the portrait of Mabel and of her sister Mary are two of the most tender things in the play, really, and particularly remarkable and important, I think, because these were, of course, the ancestors of the present-day Unionists, and a community which is sort of the Ulster Protestants, who are seen across the world as sort of narrow, bigoted, archaic in their religious beliefs, unwilling to compromise with anyone. And Friel gives a most beautiful picture, really, of the two women, and I think it's interesting that he used the women to do it. And what Mabel brings to this marriage are, I suppose, the qualities, the sterling qualities of the sort of English yeoman. She's common sense, good husbandry, tolerance, willingness to compromise, those sorts of things. And by making it such clearly a happy and a fruitful marriage from which both sides get such a lot, it seems a very beautiful piece of symbolism for what the Protestant community in Northern Ireland could bring to Ireland, and hopefully one day may.
My dilemma. Help me, Mary. Which hand do I grasp? Because either way I make an enemy. Either way I interfere with that slow, sure tide of history. No, that's unfair. I mustn't embarrass you. Let's put it another way. Which choice would history approve? Or to use the Archbishop's language, if the future historian had a choice of my two alternatives, which would he prefer for his acceptable narrative? Tell me.
I don't know anything about history, Hugh.
All right then, which hand should I grasp?
Queen Elizabeth made you an earl, and you accepted that title. And you know that that title carries with it certain duties and responsibilities.
Those duties I have honored faithfully.
Then as long as you continue to do that, Hugh, and if you are at peace with your conscience, you have no dilemma.
What Field Day is about is trying to forge some new sense of cultural identity for Irish people, which is free both of the influence of London and Britain and England, but also equally free of the sort of the very dangerous mythologies that seem to come in a way from the nationalist tradition of the South. Not dangerous for the South anymore because the South is peaceful, but still quite dangerous in the North, and trying to create a space in which people can think about how they can come to terms in their own identity with the very stark and brutal and painful realities with which they've been presented by 20 years of violence in the North, the compromises that are going to have to be made, the acceptance of the other person's point of view, the other person's tradition, which they hold very strongly, and of trying to reconcile those in some new way, and which takes both of them on board. And I think that they've tried to do that, particularly through their publishing, through the series of pamphlets which they've published, which have come from both sides in the North.
In 1983, Field Day expanded into publishing, overseen by the poets on its board of directors.
It very quickly became obvious that Stephen and Brian had ideas of expanding beyond the theatre into publishing and into creating in Field Day some kind of focus, nucleus, a group that would have a political and cultural preoccupation or set of preoccupations. We knew that the pamphlets had to have as one of their preoccupations language and its use and its abuse and the political force which it had, even in apparently innocent situations.
Next year, Field Day will publish its biggest undertaking to date, an anthology of Irish writing from 550 AD to the present day, an historic collection of work drawn from all the different traditions in Irish culture.
I think what this anthology should have some effect upon is the ease and the facility and sometimes the mindlessness with which we name things and have named things over and over again as either literary or political, as economic, as against, or as well as social. I mean, we have economic writings in there. We have polite letters, private letters, propaganda, documents, penal laws, Declaration of the Republic, writings from a variety of politicians and rhetoricians, and what you would expect from the poets and novelists, dramatists, and so forth as well. And I think it's when you see them together that you realize just how cousinly they are.
And when I was editing my section of the anthology, what I had been drawn to was a specifically northern Protestant tradition of oratory, of making speeches, giving sermons, creating certain political structures. As an example of that would be, say, the Ulster Covenant of 1912, and so on.
Being convinced in our consciences that Home Rule would be disastrous to the material well-being of Ulster as well as of the whole of Ireland, subversive of our civil and religious freedom, destructive of our citizenship and perilous to the unity of the Empire, we, whose names are underwritten, men of Ulster...
I felt that these, sometimes termed cultural artefacts, hadn't been attended to, so it would be interesting to try and find them and edit them and put notes to them and introductions to them. So I found myself getting up at 5:30 in the morning to read, endless Presbyterian sermons, to select bits from them. I'm not to really privilege one tradition over the other, so that you wouldn't necessarily be saying, right, this is the ideology, take it or leave it, but these are the ideologies, make what you want of them.
In a way, this anthology is a way of remaking our sense of our history. But anyone who wishes to stay loyal to his or her version of what Irish experience is certainly will find the material for that in the anthology. But you will only find that material at the expense of ignoring other material.
Around the green laurels of Bonnywood Green, where me and my true love of times were seen. The years they rolled by and how happy were we, for as little she thought that a soldier I'd be. And it was early one morning when the lambs they did play, and off to Kells barracks I there made my way. And there I enlisted to fight for the king, to uphold a good cause I live Bonnywood Green.
The ballads would be in the anthology because the ballads are part of the oral literature of Ireland. But what you get in the songs themselves, you wouldn't get in the pages of any history book. What you would get in the songs is how people felt at the time, whether they felt remorse or whether they felt a deep feeling of regret or submission or surrender, or whether they felt triumph, or whether they saw some side of the battle or the engagement that was never registered at all in the history books. I think that's what you would get, and they're valuable for that. They're only true emotionally. Factually, they sometimes coincide with the truth.
Oh, Bonnywood Green, oh, Bonnywood Green, to uphold a good cause I left Bonnywood Green. And then we were ordered to cross o'er the foam, for soldiers were needed to fight for their home. I kissed my love Nell, she appeared like a queen, and softly she whispered, remember Wood Green. round Bonnywood Green, round Bonnywood Green, for they all wear white aprons round the Bonnywood Green.
There's a huge set of legend, myth and literature accruing to the idea of a sense of place. People may be awful, but actually the land that they live on gives them the land gives them a possibility of coming together. I think that there is actually some simple, incontrovertible truth in that people on the ground want to stand their ground and hold on to it, you know. But I had a notion that if people could cherish where they are, and I'm not saying that this would change their behaviour, but it would give them a perspective, and it would give them a deeper sense of memory and self than is offered to them by the mythologies and ideologies of present-day Ulster.
We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up an astounding crate full of air. Butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered, salty and white. The ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They'll never dig coal here, only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp. Our pioneers keep striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet centre is bottomless.
I really have a strong sense of the first place where I grew up, around Broken Mossbond in South Derry, as my home. But there was tradition always about Banagher. This is Banagher graveyard, actually, and this tombstone is the tombstone of St. Muradach O'Heaney, a local saint, probably 8th, 9th century. And so my great-grandfather was a journeyman tailor, they said. So if there's any digging in the family, it originated after that time. But we didn't hear much about St. Muradach at all, but a woman once came to the house and asked my father to lift sand at this graveyard. Now, there's a tradition, superstition, that if somebody called Heaney lifts the sand in Banagher graveyard and the sand is cast at anyone, it will bring good luck. How true this is, I'm not sure.
When you're doing a play, different things assume different values in different places. You know, the play sounds different in Dungannon than it does in Sligo, than it does in Enniskillen, than it does in Coleraine. That's one of the beauties of touring. You have a different play every night. What I get out of it is the pleasure of knowing that as an actor, I'm not just a kind of jobbing actor in this situation, that I am exploring ideas and concepts that are central to me as someone living in this country at this particular moment.
Program's a pound. How are you?
A field day could produce an idea of the culture that is not only understood, but that is at some deep level accepted by a large number of people. When, for instance, we take the theatre to smaller towns and villages that normally would not see theatre, we're not simply trying to pick up a new audience. We are actually trying to present to that audience something they already know, but we're trying to present it to them in such a way that we can say, here is a way of not only understanding it, but actually being creative with it.
Here we are. I want you to meet two of my friends, Mabel. Hugh O'Donnell. Sir Hugh O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell. My wife, Mabel.
I'm pleased to meet you.
And Dr. Peter Lombard, titular Bishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland.
I'm pleased to meet you.
We've got to keep on the right side of Peter. He's writing our history.
That seems to make you uneasy for some reason.
Not as long as you tell the truth.
You keep insisting on this truth, Hugh.
Don't you believe in the truth, Archbishop?
I don't believe that a period of history, a given space of time, my life, your life, contains within it one true interpretation just waiting to be mined. But I do believe that it may contain within it several possible narratives.
I taught this period in history for many years, so obviously the playwright departed from what you might call historical accuracy at times, but I wouldn't find fault with him for that. Every dramatist is entitled to use his own material, obviously. I mean, he had Peter Lombard, my 24th predecessor, by the way, as Archbishop of Armagh, rambling around Armagh and Tyrone and Dungannon up in the early scene. And I think probably Peter Lombard never stood in Armagh in his life. He was appointed in Rome and in 1601, and he stayed on in Rome. So that while it was historically correct to have Lombard and O'Neill coming together in Rome, but again, I'm not finding fault with it for that. I thought the character of O'Neill was splendidly conceived and splendidly acted by Stephen Ray. And of course, the whole play revolves around him. And I thought, I'm sure Neil Tobin will kill me for saying this, but I thought Neil, who is associated so much with comic parts on Irish television and all that, I thought it was very hard for an audience to take him seriously as an archbishop. You know, but all in all, I enjoyed it very much.
I mean, any intelligent and critical voice coming out of Ireland is a good thing, and the people who are associated with Field Day, I think some things have been more successful than others, and it hasn't been uniform. But I think that this is another good contribution. I mean, you only have to listen to people sort of at the interval and so on, and people are thinking about it and talking about it. And what more can you ask?
We have lots of good country music today on the programme went through. We also have our usual phone-in quiz, believe me. But a very, very difficult one to get. It hasn't been that time competition now. And again, my many thanks to you for the last 2 hours. Again, like this one for Sunday morning.
The tightness and the nilness round that space. When the car stops in the road, The troops inspect its make and number. And as one bends his face towards your window, you catch sight of more on a hill beyond, eyeing with intent down-cradled guns that hold you under cover. And everything is pure interrogation until a rifle motions and you move with guarded, unconcerned acceleration. A little emptier, a little spent as always by that quiver in the self, subjugated, yes, and obedient. So you drive on to the frontier of writing, where it happens again. The guns on tripods, the sergeant with his on-off mic repeating data about you, waiting for the squawk of clearance, the marksman training down out of the sun upon you like a hawk. And suddenly you're through, arraigned yet freed, as if you'd passed from behind a waterfall on the black current of a tarmac road, past armor-plated vehicles, out between the posted soldiers, flowing and receding like tree shadows into the polished windscreen.
In keeping with tradition, Making History opened in Derry's Guildhall, and from that night a month ago, it has played to packed houses. This week, the company visited 4 different towns. 350 people saw the play on Wednesday night in Cavan Town Hall. In this scene, Hugh O'Neill pokes fun at his Protestant wife, Mabel, whom he has just introduced to his friends for the first time.
Why doesn't he speak like you?
How do I speak?
How do I speak? Like those old English knobs in Dublin.
That's why you're fair dying about me.
And I met a popish priest, Hugh. That's the first time in my life I ever even saw one of them. And I said, I'm pleased to meet you. Oh, my God, wait till my sister Mary hears this.
And your brother Henry?
Oh, Henry would shoot me, Hugh.
Would he?
You know he would. I shook the hand of a popish priest.
An archbishop?
Is that worse?
Much worse. And look at it.
What?
Your hand. It's turning black.
It's... Oh, my God, I actually looked. You're a bastard, you O'Neill. That's what you are, a real bastard.
I thought the general concept of it was totally new, like what I've been taught in school, what a whole new concept to the 9 Years' War and to what, you know, you're taught in school that they're heroes and you find out that they're human. It was unbelievable.
Did you change your views at all?
Totally. Changed. All gone.
Have you seen any of Field Day's work before?
No, never. I'm very impressed. I intend to see more.
Do you think that the arts and theatre can change people's views, and do you think they have it has anything to say to the politicians?
Well, I think that the arts are still a minority interest in this country, and unfortunately the people who will say throw bombs or kill people are not patrons of the arts. But, you know, I think that the more people can receive the message that Mr. Friel is trying to get across, the better. That life for life in this country.
Do you think that that politicians look to groups like Field Day for new ideas at all?
No, I don't think so. And I think there is a certain degree of lip service paid to the arts and to artists and so on, but I think fundamentally politicians look upon artists as occupying a kind of cloud cuckoo land for the most part. I don't think there is any kind of exchange worth talking about.
Do you think they're a political company at all?
Well, I wouldn't like to make a comment on that. I mean, I think they have to speak for themselves on that issue, but obviously their plays deal with many varied subjects and obviously touch on politics quite a lot. So from that point of view, I think that makes them political.
Do you think that the playwrights and actors have anything to say to politicians that is of interest to them?
Yes, I think they have an awful lot to say. Whether or not people will listen to them, is another matter. But quite clearly, in most of Brian Friel's plays, there are clear messages which people have to take account of.
Probably to reinforce your prejudice more times than enough. I mean, I think there's a natural tendency to go there and look for some consolation, you know, towards your own point of view, or some recognition of your own point of view, and so on. I mean, I think if it causes people to ask some questions about contemporary issues, then that's as much as you can expect. Whether the answers to those questions will necessarily change them or not is another thing.
Do you have any views on more general terms on Field Day as a company? I mean, are you familiar with their work at all?
Well, I've seen most of their pamphlets and read most of their pamphlets. I would have some question marks over some of the things they're trying to do. There clearly is an attempt, sometimes very subtle, sometimes not so subtle, as I would say it, to knock things unionist, to knock the unionist philosophy, to knock unionist history, to knock unionist traditions. They would deny this, but I mean, I could nevertheless, I think, find some evidence in the pamphlet, certainly, that they produce, which seems to do that.
You do have that kind of identification, that kind of label attached to Field Day as some kind of green activity, which is to totally misunderstand it. Of course, it includes quite a variety of versions of nationalism in its body, but it's not a monolithic one. I think it's very difficult, in fact, to reach across many of the divides, but the hand is there.
People in this country are very ready to label you as being politically activated. I don't think, I say it with certainty, not one of us had ever been in any kind of political movement or political party. You know, we were hypnotised by them. You know, and I think, I'm speaking from myself, the rest might not agree, but I find political parties loathsome. And not one of us would have any kind of doctrinaire approach to politics, or doctrinaire way of living even. So it's other people who have described us as being politically activated, and we have got a kind of green label attached to us, you know, a nationalist movement. But I don't think that's true. And certainly, if it were ever true, or I mean, this play, we would often be called, roughly in the slang of the country, like Fenian propagandists. That would be the crude, callous way of that people would have spoken about. But I think that the latest play, Making History, about Hugh O'Neill, is going to dispense that kind of label on us.
Why?
Well, because Hugh O'Neill would be regarded as one of the great heroes of Catholic Ireland, and that play of Brian Friel's Making History has dislodged him off that particular plinth.
I could sympathise with what O'Neill was trying to do in the play, namely to hold on to a way of life which he realised was slipping from him. And I can identify because in many respects Unionists in Northern Ireland are today trying to hold on to a Unionist way of life which they feel is slowly slipping away from them. On the other hand, in the play, the tactics he uses, O'Neill uses, are more akin to the tactics used by my political opponents.
I've attempted to hold together a harassed and a confused people by trying to keep them in touch with the life they knew before they were overrun. It wasn't a life of material ease, but it had its assurances and it had its dignity. And I've done that by acknowledging and indeed honouring the ceremonies and rituals and beliefs these people have practiced since before history, since before the God of Christianity was ever heard of. And at the same time, I've tried to open these people to the strange new ways of Europe, to ease them into the new assessment of things, to nudge them towards changing evaluations and beliefs. Two pursuits that can scarcely be followed simultaneously, two tasks that are almost self-cancelling. But they've got to be attempted, because the formation of nations and civilizations is a willed act.
If the formation of civilized states is a willed act, how far is it justifiable to go in achieving it?
It's up to the individual, really, how far they're prepared to go. What their capacity is. Can't answer it, really, you know. It's...
How far would you go?
Oh, I could... I mean, I could never be a soldier. Is that what you're asking me, really? I couldn't do that. I couldn't... You know...
Do you think...
I think... You know, I think what you're asking me is, would I be prepared to be violent and all that? I couldn't be, personally, but I think the violence isn't just a moral thing. It's not just a moral choice at this stage. It's a kind of reflex. And there's a great deal of establishment violence as well.
Will change happen without it?
I don't know. Does it ever? I'm not sure if it ever does. I'm not advocating it. I don't know. I mean, there comes a point where that, you know, radical action isn't necessarily violent.
There are now only 4 provinces: Ulster, Munster, Leinster and Connaught. But there were 5 once, and that missing allotment was employed as an image for other possibilities, a location for a second centre for this troubled island. We were the people who commissioned and wrote the plays and the pamphlets and the translations that looked at Ireland from the new perspective, this 5th province, this transcendent location. And from that vantage point, there are vistas that are thrilling, more than thrilling, possible.
In the name of God, herewith I set my hand to chronicle the life of Hugh O'Neill, noblest son of noble lineage, a man glorious, pure, faithful above all, who will cause mournful weeping in every territory. He will be a godlike prince, and he will be king for the span of... Damn you, Archbishop. But this is one battle I am not going to lose.
Let the credits run. And just when it looks as if it is all over, tracking shots of a long wave up a strand that breaks towards the point of a stick, writing and writing words in the old script in the running sand.